We're now going to mark the positions on the fretboard for where we're going to cut the fret slots. I'm first going to mark the positions with a ruler on the fretboard as accurately as I can by eye, and then we're going to move to a mitre block. The reason I'm going to do this first is just in case we have any problems with the mitre block, and so we're just confirming the position as we go along. Always best to measure it twice and cut it once. So now I'm just going to mark a centre line down on our fretboard. That looks good. So I'll put the ruler up against that, and then we'll clamp the ruler in place so it doesn't move. So let's get the clamp ready. Okay, just very lightly clamp that. Try and get it square and vertical. So as I say, these are just a guide so that when we are cutting the fret slots, we've got confirmation that we are in the right position. Now we're going to mark our fret positions. Now I've got my scale length calculated. I'm doing a 620mm scale length, and to calculate the fret positions, do a little bit of research on the internet and you'll find the ratios. Each fret position is simply a ratio of the scale length, so you get these fret constants calculated and multiply it by the scale length, and then you have each fret position. So the first fret constant is 0.056126, multiply by 620 for my scale length, 620mm, and I get my first position at 34.798. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is position the fretboard in the mitre block so that the fret saw is going to cut with the left of the blade right up against where I've cut the slot for the nut. And the saw here would be creating a 0 fret, and it's the centre of the blade that is where the 0 is. So we've actually got to compensate for the thickness of the blade for our 0 point. So once I've got the saw up against the edge of our nut slot, I can then position the mark for the centre line of the fretboard on the centre line of our mitre block here. And when I'm happy with that, I'm going to lightly clamp everything in place. Okay, so how I'm going to then work this for calculating our fret positions, I'm going to use some vernier calipers. And if I place the vernier caliper on the back end of the board here, and we have a block to put it up against, as we open the caliper, we'll get a reading on the calipers here, which will give us the distance that the fretboard has moved. And since it's in this direction to the right of the caliper, we will then get our fret slot positions. Okay, and then that's nice and tight. So then I'm going to zero the caliper. There's always a little bit of an error there. That's now zeroed. So we can then move our board half the thickness of the blade. The blade thickness is 0.6 of a millimetre, so I need to move this 0.3 of a millimetre. So I move the board a little bit more than I need to, open up the caliper, and then I just press back on the board and work it back in so that the display on the caliper comes down to 0.3 of a millimetre. 0.29, I can live with that. So I'm then going to zero the caliper. First of all, I'm going to just move the fretboard up to the mark that we've made, so we're roughly in the right position, a little bit further. Make sure everything's still on the centre line. Open up our caliper. We get our digital reading there, 36.43, and we want 34.798. We're going to round that up to 34.8. 34.79, close enough. I'm just making sure that my centre line at each end is on the centre line here so that this board is exactly square. Then we can clamp the fretboard, check that the fret saw is right on that mark that we made, so we know we're pretty much in the right sort of place. Looks spot on to me. This mitre block, it's a very nice little tool. It allows you to adjust the gap between the slots, so you get it so that the blade will move tightly without any wobble. You can also adjust the depth of cut with these blocks on the side, so you can get it to cut just the right depth. I'm actually not going to cut the full depth of the frets, just so I've got a good enough fret slot, and then in the final process just before we fret we'll then cut the slots to the right depth. So let's start cutting. Just gently let the saw do the work. We're cutting down probably about about 1.5 millimeters, I think. Let me have that. Okay. Everything's still square, and we leave the blade in position. We want to make sure we're locking that in position. Everything's locked, nothing's moving. So just as we did when we were setting it up to start with, we've now going to move this up. This is going to make our new 0 position. So that is nice and tightly in there. And then what I've done on the spreadsheet is I've made calculations for the next set of fret positions relative to the 4th position. So the next fret is 27.6 millimeters away from the 4th. And we're going to continue doing this process throughout the whole length. Once we get to the point where the caliper hasn't got enough length left, we're going to re-zero the caliper and continue. So we could introduce cumulative errors doing this, but as long as we're doing it very carefully and very precisely, we've got we're going to do this 1, 2, 3, 4 more times, and the error will be extremely small. You wouldn't want to do a fretboard by measuring each slot position relative to the previous position, because then you will accumulate an error across the whole length. Ideally you start from one end and move all the way along, but I have marked some positions in the start with the ruler, so we're making sure that we are not going to be too far off, and we should still be within 0.05 of a millimeter at worst. If we're only 1 or 2 hundredths out on each position, then we're not going to be too far off. Ready for the next step, inlaying the fret marking positions. Pearl inlaying.